Hi, this is Dr. Rob Cywes, the Carbaddictiondoc, back with another episode, and I think this is going to be a big one. This is our take, our understanding, our conceptual advice on intermittent fasting in a carbohydrate addiction model. I love the term, but I absolutely hate it. Huh? Why? Okay, let me go through this, and let's start with a history of intermittent fasting. Let's go way, way back, before we were ever farmers, kind of to where our genes are uh, really in evolution at the moment. We're way ahead of where we are genetically. You've heard me talk about this. We are stuck in the late hunter-gatherer era in terms of our genes. And if you think about how the hunter-gatherers, the one thing that defined hunter-gatherers was an inability to store food. So what they would do is they would hunt and kill food and eat to abundance, and then for a long period of time, they might go without being able to eat, and they supplemented their food with vegetables that they found that they knew had access to. So hunter-gatherers, their biggest pressure was in the consistency of being able to find food. And there were long periods of time, particularly in times of drought or in winter times, where they didn't have adequate access to food. So they'd store food internally and they'd fatten up. And that's one of the reasons we as a species have become successful, because we can use carbohydrates to fatten up. But ultimately, we are omnicarnivores. We are primarily carnivores, animal eaters, who occasionally can supplement our diet with an omnivorous diet. But in those insecure times of the hunter-gatherer society, there were long periods of time where we didn't have access to food. And what was that called? Well, if you're not eating, you're fasting. So there were long periods of time where we didn't eat, but it wasn't a big deal because we had, if we were successful, adequate stores that we could live off, either through winter or through a drought or through periods between hunting where we didn't eat. And they might have been long. They might have been a day. They might have been 3 or 4 days. And a lot of carnivorous animals will only eat every few days, and yet they're able to sustain themselves. So the genetic and evolutionary backstory to intermittent fasting is just the periods of time, long periods of time, where we didn't eat. Now, part of the pressure for hunter-gatherer societies that weren't doing so well was to try to find a consistent source of food. So we started herding our animals, and then we started farming crops. And we became better and better and better at doing those two things. And really what they did is they gave us consistent access to food so that we could eat more often. And yes, our genetics slowly caught up with that to a certain extent, where we should be eating, ideally, if we have access to food, once, maybe twice a day. And in those 1 or 2 meals a day, there's enough time to store food, and then between meals to have kind of an ebb and flow. So you consume food, you use some of it, you store some of it, and then for a long period of time you don't eat until you run out of those stores, be they micronutrients or macronutrients, calories or nutrients, and then you eat again. And in the ideal world of abundance, we go back and forth like that, typically eating once or twice a day. If you're more on the vegetarian side, you eat a little bit more often because you can't extract a lot of fat from the vegetarian food, and you've got to turn that sugar to fat. Or if you're more on the carnivorous side, you eat once, maybe twice a day, or once every other day. That's kind of the spectrum that we omnicarnivores are ideally suited to. But as we became better and better at farming, better and better at raising crops and at herding and stockpiling those herds, we started to change how we were eating. We started to eat more and more sugar and starch, and we started to have access to more of the grain crops that had sugar and starch. So we went away from being in ketosis for most of the time when we were eating animals to being in glucosis, where we're burning sugar and starch in our bloodstream as a fuel source. And we still used fat as a dominant fuel source, but more and more for longer periods of time, we used sugar. And that's where we increased the frequency of our diets. Why do we increase the frequency? Because we can't store sugar for very long. The liver and our muscles and our tissues can hold about 3 to 4 hours, maybe 6 hours of adequate sugar when we're busy doing stuff that's physically active. And in those days, we were pretty physically active without exercising. So we would run out of sugar supply in our liver, and yes, our liver could make a little bit of sugar from fat and protein. We'd flip over into ketosis. But when the primary drive was carbohydrates, we started to eat twice a day on average. And if you look at the peasant communities that raised these crops, they typically were carbohydrate based, they had carbohydrate staples, and they would eat once or twice a day, typically twice a day. They'd have their bread, they'd have their rice, they'd have their potatoes, they'd have their grains in the morning, and again in the evening, maybe supplemented with some animal products from time to time and some other vegetables. But again, in those peasant communities, why did the carbohydrates not harm them? Well, it might have harmed their teeth, it might have harmed a few other parts, but it didn't cause the obesogenic comorbidities because they had long periods of time where they weren't eating. So they didn't become diabetic. You don't become diabetic if you eat carbohydrates once or twice a day. And especially if those carbohydrates are starchy so that the absorption takes a little bit of time. Your insulin process can keep pace with that. So while biologically it's not necessarily the best thing, it gave larger and larger populations of humans the ability to survive and thrive when we became carbohydrate-based as a staple. Now let's fast forward. Let's go to the manufacturing era, where we're now able to manufacture carbohydrates into things that combine sugar and fat. Now we're getting into an era where we are not eating for biological and nutritional survival. We're now creating a subspecies or a subsegment of our food that we're consuming not for its nutritional value, but for its endorphin value, for the high that we get, for the buzz, for its emotional value, for its relaxation value. And we're not only doing that in quantity, we're also doing it in frequency. So we're eating more often. And guess what word we invent then? What concept we invent? We invent the concept of breakfast. We invent the concept of snack. A snack, trademarked by me, a snack is always an emotional event, never a nutritional event. And in order to be an emotional event, it has to be an endorphin activator. And those are your refined sugar, your high sugar carbohydrates. So we migrated away from eating for staples, for the nutritional value of food, hunter-gatherer peasant communities, farming peasant communities, toward now our modern society where we are establishing a whole rhythm, a whole routine of using sugar and starch to manage our mental health, not our nutritional health. And as a consequence of that chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption for mental health, we became fat and sick. Because the consequence of chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, where there's no ebb and flow, is to overwhelm the insulin-glucagon system, the hormonal protection system, to become insulin resistant and get diseases like diabetes, like obesity, like polycystic ovarian syndrome, like inflammation, like cancer, like sleep apnea, like fatty liver. And all the diseases we're getting sick and dying from now are a consequence of chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption to the point of addiction. So that's our evolution. We've just become too damn good as human beings. And the reality is, why did we become good? Because we ate fat for our brains. The good part is in a century or two, we're going to become less good if we continue this pathway. Okay, so now we're in an era where people come to the Western world from, let's say, Asia, and this is kind of where the concept of intermittent fasting came from. It really arose with guys like Jason Fung in the Toronto era. Well, Toronto is a wonderful city. I lived there. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. Lived there for almost 10 years. But Toronto is this eclectic mix of people from all over the world. In fact, there are far fewer Canadian-born people in Toronto than people born elsewhere. And I still believe that the Italian and the Chinese population are the dominant populations in Toronto. And I think the Chinese are. Well, where do they come from? They come from cultures that eat very differently to the mental health eaters of the Americas. America has become a society of eating for our mental health, really doing drugs called carbohydrates for our mental health. They come from peasant and subsistence farming groups. The Indians, the Pakistanis, the Chinese migrated over to Canada. And they fundamentally ate or eat carbohydrates as a staple, whether it's naan, whether it's papadum, whether it is rice, even the South Americans, where they eat a lot of potatoes, and the Argentinas, rice and beans. Culturally, where I come from, is a lot of sorghum. It's the grain-based products of those worlds. And those populations come over to America, and they still have that staple carbohydrate as a foundation of their eating. But now they've added in all the mental health carbohydrates, and they become fat and diabetic. The East Indians have one of the highest diabetes populations in the world because genetically they don't have the ability typically to produce a lot of insulin. So they're not obesogenic, they're diabesogenic. Some of the Chinese are more obesogenic. Having said all of that, and that's a separate podcast you can go to of mine, having said that, now these populations are getting fat and sick in their new world. It's kind of my story. I was a skinny little runt when I was in Africa. Moved to the Americas, the US and Canada as a 20-year-old, discovered the euphoria of carbohydrates, and by the time I quit playing rugby, which was my sport, I was 300 pounds. Why? Because I started to use sugar and starch from a mental health perspective, from an emotion management perspective, rather than as a staple. So I understand how that happens, and I understand how it happens in these immigrant communities. So what did Jason and other people like him do? And I love Jason Fung's work. But he started saying, okay, we know that this diabetes, these carbohydrates are causing damage to our kidneys. Jason's a nephrologist. So he said, we've got to get rid of the carbohydrates. And he sat down with his Indian population, he sat down with his Chinese and Eastern populations, and he said, dudes, you've got to quit eating carbohydrates, you're diabetic. And they said, screw you. We've done this forever. We've eaten carbohydrates as a staple forever. So Jason said, oh my God, I'm dealing with all these diabetic people with end-stage kidneys, and they won't give up their carbohydrates. Well, you know what? When I go back home to the East, when I look at the Indian population, the way they eat, yes, they're carbohydrate dominant, but they eat once in the morning and once in the evening. And culturally and religiously, they have long periods of time in their native countries where they don't eat. You think about Muslims. Muslims go through a fast called Ramadan. And from sunrise to sunset, they only drink water. So they're basically on a water fast during the day. And the majority of religious cultures have fasting built into that. Whether you're Catholic, whether you're Jewish, fasting is a large part of that self-reflection. It's part of a religious experience. And it's culturally endemic in people who come from a religious background. So if people are not willing to give up their carbohydrates, maybe we can lessen the frequency with which they eat those carbohydrates. And if I can get my population to eat once in the morning and once in the evening and not eat during the day, guess what that's doing? It's creating ebb and flow. They're eating mostly their starches, and their diabetes and their obesity is going to improve. May not completely go away, but it's going to get a hell of a lot better. And guess what we did? We created that as a concept called intermittent fasting. And it started out asking populations that weren't willing to give up their carbohydrates to see how long in the day they could go without consuming calories. And it has a religious fundamental background to it, but we leverage that for the health of the population. So smart, such a cool idea. But really what it was going periods of time of not eating. But we called it, we labeled it intermittent fasting, and we created it as this new sexy cure, and I love that. But the reality is it's based on just not eating for protracted periods of time. And then it kind of took on a life of its own. So if I can go 8 hours without eating, and maybe do all my eating in a 6 to 8 hour window, then I'm developing a 16-8 or an 18-6, where I'm going 18 hours or 16 hours without eating, including my sleeping time, and I'm doing all my eating in a 6 hour window. Or maybe doing a 23-1, where I'm eating one meal a day. And guess what? That ebb and flow allows my body time to recover when it's not eating. It's not getting into nutritional deficiency. It's not getting into starvation because there's enough stores, but I'm able to utilize my stores and flip my body back and forth. Instead of just coming in all the time with snacking, I'm now changing that. And vicarious to that, I'm depriving myself of my emotion management system, which is snacking. But it's done vicariously in intermittent fasting, not intentionally like it's done in the carbohydrate addiction model. So a different way of getting to the same result. And I love the intermittent fasting concept. But ultimately, if you're going to get rid of your diseases, you want to add intermittent fasting to your carbohydrate reduction. Because here's the problem with with a carbohydrate dominant person in an intermittent fasting world. It's damn difficult. It's damn difficult. Why? It's biologically difficult and psychologically difficult. If I'm psychologically addicted to carbohydrates, even just going 6 to 8 hours is quite a challenge, quite a struggle, particularly under emotional duress. And if people that advocate for intermittent fasting do not understand carbohydrate addiction, they're never going to understand relapse. Okay? So, from a mental health perspective, I can go on a good day 12, 16 hours without eating. But when life throws a curveball at me, when I've had a rough day, when I'm tired, when I'm stressed out, I go and find solace. I go and find emotional reprieve in my snacks and screw intermittent fasting. So, under those conditions where we don't recognize the addictive nature of carbohydrates, unfortunately, intermittent fasting becomes part of a diet, part of the diet algorithm. We're doing it for weight loss, we're doing it to get rid of diabetes, but it's unsustainable because it's got an endpoint. And we don't address the mental health consequences. We don't do the removal and the replacement. And remember this, and this is a critically important statement, 98% of diets fail. You may lose a lot of weight, your disease may get better, but whether it's Atkins diet, whether it's keto diet, whether it's a cookie diet, whether it's Dr. Oz, whether it's Weight Watchers, whether it's Nutrisystem, whether it is intermittent fasting, 98% of those diets, when they're viewed as diets, fail because they fail to replace the mental health aspects of eating and drinking carbohydrates with something else. So I love the concept of intermittent fasting as a piece of our program, but not as a standalone. The other issue with intermittent fasting, and what Jason did very, very well, is we know when people are snacking on carbohydrates, every time you snack on a carbohydrate, your insulin has to be released from the pancreas. And what insulin does is it causes your blood sugar to drop. So you eat those simple carbohydrates, your blood sugar goes up, insulin causes your blood sugar to drop. And every time your blood sugar drops, you get hungry. And then you eat again. So the frequency of snack, 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 meal, 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 the frequency of eating 6, 8, 10, 12 times in a day is not only a mental health function, but it's also a biological function related to fluctuations in our blood sugar. And then when you become insulin resistant, now you've got tons of insulin all the time floating around in your body, and you need to deal with that insulin with feeding it sugar all the time, because if you don't, your blood sugar goes too low. So the disease of insulin resistance forces people to eat frequently. And Jason understood that, so his mechanism of getting people to do intermittent fasting is to start slowly. Don't eat in the morning. Don't eat till 2 o'clock in the day. Or eat once at lunchtime and once at 6 o'clock, compressing that. 6 to 8 hours of eating gives you 18 hours of not eating. So you slowly get used to biologically not eating. And your body gets used to coming out of insulin resistance, which is wonderful. It's healthy. You lose weight, you can lose a ton of weight, and your diabetes and other diseases go away. But it's unsustainable unless you understand the carbohydrate addiction element of sugar and starch as a mental health management program. Because you didn't do it intentionally, you did it vicariously. So use intermittent fasting as a way to biologically change your insulin resistance and your body's dependence on frequent carbohydrate consumption. But it's critically important that at the same time, you also understand and deal with the emotion management side. So getting into ketosis, where you're burning fat, not sugar, helps you to level out those highs and lows from sugar, but also know the mental health side. This chapter is the first of 2 chapters when it comes to intermittent fasting. Tune in tomorrow for the next episode on how to use IF, intermittent fasting, in a ketogenic lifestyle. I hope you enjoyed that podcast. If you did, please click the subscribe button and become a subscriber to my YouTube channel. And if that message resonated with you and made you think, and you made a decision to do more to help yourself, but you need help, please come and see us. Set up a consultation. We can do it in person in my offices in Palm Beach Gardens at 561-627-4107, or in Jacksonville, Florida at 904-410-3934. I also do some long-distance consults telephonically or on Zoom. Set that up as well by calling 561-627-4107. We help people to manage their diabetes better and also to get started in obesity management. Or if you've had bariatric or obesity surgery and are struggling, give us a shout. We can help to get you back on track.